curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Abram lived in Ur of the Chaldees. There were several ancient cities by the name of Ur, but the phrase Ur of the Chaldees makes it clear which city was Abram's home. The Urartuans worshipped a group of gods whom they called the Chaldees. Near Lake Van, several inscriptions have been found, one of which mentions 63 gods followed by 16 goddesses. One inscription states, "This is the spoil of the cities which I obtained for the people of Chaldees in 1 year." Ur today is called Urfa, and was in the plain of Shinar, where the great apostasy of Noah's family had fully bloomed into profound paganism. Abram's family had remained near Babel when the other groups had left the region. When he received the command to leave for Canaan, Abram gathered his family and left Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there. Ancient Haran, where they stopped and stayed until Abram's father died, still bears its ancient name and is located just 19 miles down the Balak River from ancient Ur. Further evidence of Abram, later called Abraham, in this region is the presence of the names of other members of his family, all still preserved within a radius of about 25 miles. His great-grandfather, Serug's, name is preserved in the town of Suruk, about 22 miles west of Haran. And between Haran and Urfa is Tel Terahi, which means the ruin of Terah, who was Abraham's father. And of course Haran was the name of Abram's brother, who was the father of Lot. Slowly at first, in Canaan Abraham's family grew. His son Isaac bore 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. It was Jacob who would inherit the position of patriarch at Isaac's death, and it was his sons and grandsons who would one day formally become the nation called Israel. Among the 12 sons of Jacob, one was especially favored by him, Joseph. And unwisely Jacob showed his favor by bestowing upon the boy a special coat of many colors, which caused great jealousy among the other sons. Their jealousy was made even greater by the dreams that Joseph had and shared with his family, dreams which indicated that he would one day occupy a position of great authority and that the others would bow down unto him. One day when his older brothers were tending the flocks in Shechem, Jacob sent Joseph to see if all was well with them. When Joseph approached them from afar, the brothers' jealousy caused them to plot Joseph's death. Only his brother Reuben saved the 17-year-old's life by insisting that they not kill him, but instead cast him into a pit. Stripping him of his special coat, they did so, and when a company of Ishmaelites taking spices and balm to Egypt approached, they decided to sell their brother as a common slave to these men for 20 pieces of silver. But in spite of the horrendous betrayal and ordeal this young man suffered, Joseph remained faithful to the God of his fathers and became a shining light in a land of darkness. He accepted his life in this foreign land among a heathen nation and became a trusted servant to a high-ranking official of the Pharaoh. Then Joseph was falsely accused of a terrible crime and was imprisoned. When all hope must have appeared lost, he was summoned to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. The interpretation of those dreams by Joseph had warned of an impending 7-year famine, which was to follow a 7-year period of plenty. Deeply impressed by the young man, Pharaoh asked Joseph's advice on what to do to avert a great nationwide calamity, and because of the wisdom displayed in his reply, the Pharaoh appointed him to collect the grain and prepare for the famine. So grateful was the Pharaoh to Joseph and his God that he appointed Joseph to a position second only to the Pharaoh. "Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." And it was through the obedience of Joseph that a special haven for the descendants of Abraham was provided. During the famine, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt to get grain. There Joseph recognized his brothers whom he had long ago forgiven. After he had tested them, he revealed his identity to the shocked and fearful sons of Jacob. When they realized Joseph intended no harm to them in spite of their grievous deed, they obeyed Joseph's command that they bring their father and entire family to Egypt. During the famine, Joseph had bought all the land of Egypt for the Pharaoh except for land grants made to the various priests, and allowed the people to live on the land and return 1/5 of their increase to the king. When Jacob's family arrived, the Pharaoh honored Joseph by bestowing upon them the right to live in the best of the land of Egypt, the land of Goshen, which was the beautiful and fertile Nile Delta. It is also called the land of Ramses, or Ra, the Creator, the sun god. And it was here that God's chosen people would grow and thrive, from the 70 souls who came with Jacob until they became a great multitude. Though many have claimed there is no evidence of the story of Joseph in ancient Egypt, on an island just below the first cataract of the Nile, an ancient inscription written around the 4th century B.C. was found which claimed to be a copy of a document written by Pharaoh Djoser more than 1,000 years earlier. It is the story of a land grant made by the Pharaoh to the priests of the god Num. It tells of 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, how Pharaoh had a dream and consulted his chancellor for help. It contains most elements of the 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty story, although they were corrupted in this account written over 1,000 years after the event took place. But most importantly, the priests who wrote this inscription were relying upon the land grants made by this Pharaoh to justify their claim to some land. They were not writing what they believed was an ancient myth. They obviously believed the land grants made by Pharaoh Djoser to still be valid and of enough authority to still be in effect well over 1,000 years later. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. Only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion assigned them of Pharaoh. Ancient Egyptian records list Djoser as the 16th Pharaoh of Egypt, and historians have classified him with the so-called Third Dynasty. His chancellor, named Imhotep, was first known through the writings of the Egyptian historian Manetho, who in the 3rd century B.C. wrote, "During Djoser's reign there lived a man named Imhotep, who had the reputation of the Greek god of medicine, and who invented the art of building with hewn stone." The legends attributed to Imhotep were so incredible that he was considered to be mythical until this century, when excavations at Djoser's pyramid complex revealed the base of a statue with the name Djoser on it and the name Imhotep, with his long list of titles, one of which was Chief under the King, a title which first appears with Imhotep and also was first bestowed upon Joseph. Imhotep was also the architect of Pharaoh Djoser's pyramid and surrounding complex, a veritable city within a city of incredible beauty and extremely advanced in design. Built on the plateau of Saqqara adjacent to ancient Memphis, the pyramid within the complex is the first ever built in Egypt. Ron Wyatt spent a great deal of time here searching for evidence which might shed light on the biblical account. Such an event as the famine described in the story of Joseph and the distribution of grain to the other countries would have required a major facility and system of organization. When the famine came and Joseph's brothers came from Canaan to get grain from Egypt, we are told that they went to Joseph, which indicates that he personally oversaw the distribution, at least to those coming from foreign countries. And this would mean that there was certainly a central location or granary to which the foreigners came. The complex at Saqqara contains 11 massive pits, which even the Egyptians are at a loss to explain. They are not tombs, for all tombs were underground and carefully sealed, while these were accessible from the surface, and they are extremely large. But most fascinating is the fact that they are all connected by chutes. Ron believes these were the grain storage pits of the 7-year famine. As grain was removed from one pit, Grain from the other pits flowed through the chutes, making the grain always accessible from one location. These are within the wall of the step pyramid complex, which has only one entrance, and it opens to a long covered passageway with small cubicles on each side, each just the right size for a person to sit with perhaps a small table. The narrow, singular entrance would have allowed only a few people to enter at a time. There was no doubt in Ron's mind that this was the main center of grain distribution on a massive scale. When they arrived to get their grain, the people lined up to enter the long corridor. Once inside, they paid one of the cashiers in one of the cubicles for the amount of grain they wished to purchase. After payment was made, perhaps they were given a sack for grain which reflected the amount of their payment. Then they proceeded through the corridor, straight to the area of the grain bins. Once there, they descended the stairway next to the storage bins, handed their sack to a worker who filled it and returned it to them. Then they exited through a small door on the lower level, which led to the outside of the complex. When the pits were first excavated, bits of grain still remained in them, but the official explanation was that it was the remains of food placed in graves for the deceased. However, as we mentioned, these bear no resemblance to any ancient Egyptian tombs, but they do bear a marked resemblance to pits identified as grain storage bins in other ancient civilizations. During the 7-year famine, Egypt gained great wealth and prominence among the nations through the selling of the grain. The Egyptians who lived in their cities along the Nile had little to do during the famine, since they had a 7-year supply of grain to rely on and were able to devote their time to the building projects of the Pharaoh, not as slaves, but as grateful subjects. The family of Jacob, who lived in the Delta, separate from the native population, prospered and grew, exempt from the 1/5 taxation levied on the native population. From the time Jacob's family came to Egypt until the birth of Moses was about 180 years. Many pharaohs had come and gone, many ruling contemporaneously with others in different regions, but until now all recognized the rights granted to the people of Israel to live in the land of Ramses. But that was about to change. Exodus 1:8. There arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Israel had remained a separate race from the Egyptians, and had grown and prospered to such an extent that they were viewed as a potential enemy nation right in the midst of Egypt. But the Pharaoh didn't want to banish the Israelites, because they were skilled craftsmen, adding great wealth to the nation. By oppressing them with the bondage of hard labor, he sought to subdue them and crush their spirit. When this failed, the king then sought to decrease their number by issuing a decree that every Hebrew male born alive was to be cast into the river and drowned. It was at this time that Moses was born, and hid by his mother in an ark of bulrushes placed in the river, and rescued by the Pharaoh's own daughter. Raised as the Pharaoh's grandson, he was considered part of the royal family, but his loyalties remained with his own people. When Moses killed an Egyptian for smiting a fellow Hebrew, he incurred the wrath of his adopted grandfather, the Pharaoh, and he fled Egypt to Midian. There he married the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, a worshipper of the true Creator. 40 years later, he was called of God at the burning bush to lead his now enslaved people out of Egypt. The rest of the story is well known, but the apparent lack of any evidence has led scholars to either doubt the truth of the entire story, to try to downplay the events and explain them in terms of natural science, or explain them as normal events which were blown out of proportion. Ron Wyatt believed they occurred exactly as the Bible stated. After the final plague, which took the lives of the firstborn throughout all of Egypt, Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Rise up, and get you forth from among the people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said, and take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." With sandaled feet and staff in hand, the people of Israel had stood hushed, awed, yet expectant, awaiting the royal mandate that they should bid them go forth. Before the morning broke, they were on their way. The Israelites had been scattered throughout the empire of Egypt by this time. As slaves, they were bound to go wherever they were told to work for the Pharaoh. But during the plagues, they had all slowly returned to Goshen or Ramses. Exodus 12:37. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. They journeyed from the land of Ramses or Goshen, and encamped or gathered at Succoth. When the people were given the feast of unleavened bread, God told them, "For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever." This scripture clearly told Ron that they left Egypt that very day, and that Succoth was outside of Egypt proper. Many Egyptologists and scholars agree that the ancient Egyptian frontier fortress, called Tharu or Thaku, was ancient Succoth of the Exodus account, as it corresponds linguistically with the Hebrew word. Thaku was the last Egyptian city on the northeastern border, and was where the ancient pharaohs organized their armies as they prepared to go to war to the north and east. It was the only place large enough for several million people with their flocks and herds to be gathered together. And the journey of such a massive group would have been impossible without order, and Ron believed that it was at Succoth or Thaku that they were organized for travel. Here their journey began, but where were they going? Moses had asked to take the people 3 days' journey out of the land of Egypt to worship the true God. But by the command of God, Moses knew they would not return. He had been in Midian when he had seen the burning bush and had been called by the Lord to deliver his people out of bondage. And though he had been told he would lead them to the promised land, they were first to come to Mount Sinai, for God had told him, Exodus 3:12, "This shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." Many scholars agreed that Midian was in the northwest sector of present-day Saudi Arabia, but they somehow missed the fact that Mount Sinai was also in Midian. So, from Succoth, they set out from Midian and Mount Sinai. But the direct route, which would take them directly east, since they had to go around the eastern finger of the Red Sea, was too dangerous. Exodus 13:17, "And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, Lest peradventure the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt." The Philistines lived along the coasts. Ancient records show peaceful relations between the Philistines and Egypt at this time, but had they encountered the Israelites, they would have regarded them as escaping slaves and captured them to return them to Egypt. Therefore, God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. Throughout known history, the desolate peninsula located between the two fingers of the Red Sea has remained uninhabited except for small, isolated groups of Bedouin. The ancient Egyptians operated mines there, but the conditions for life were so terrible that one official left a stele behind telling of his experiences there. Quote, "The highlands are hot in the summer, and the mountains brand the skin." And this desolate and forbidding region, nestled between the two fingers of the northern end of the Red Sea, was quite reasonably called in the biblical account the wilderness of the Red Sea. Instead of taking the people across the flat northern plain, Moses led them through the more mountainous region where they were protected by the mountains. At the end of 3 days, when the Israelites continued their journey, instead of returning in the direction of Egypt, spies and lookouts flashed signals across the mountains. Exodus 14:5. And it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled. When they arrived at Etham, in the edge of the wilderness, they had almost reached the northern tip of the arm of the Red Sea called the Gulf of Aqaba. But it was here that God had another plan for his people. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal-zephon. Before it shall ye encamp by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in. Had they continued their present course, they would have soon reached safety. But instead they turned south and entered into a massive group of mountains that were without escape. The winding 18-mile-long canyon, today called Wadi Watir, twisted towards the seashore, at times less than 100 feet wide. It constantly looked like a dead end up ahead, but as they continued their journey, the mountains would seem to open up as they approached. Pharaoh knew the area and felt confident when he stated, They are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in. Once they entered the Wadi Watir, there was no way out until they reached the sea. God had foretold how long their flight from the Egyptians would be when he gave them the feast of the unleavened bread, or bread of haste, which lasted 7 days. From Sukkoth to the beach at the Red Sea is about 140 miles. Could they have traveled this far in such a short time? Exodus 13:21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud, to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night. Traveling both day and night, they would have had only to average about 1 mile per hour, or 24 miles a day, to reach the sea in 6 days. Once they arrived at the sea, they encamped, but in great fear, for here they certainly felt trapped. Stories of the ordeal must have been passed down through many generations, for 1,500 years later the Jewish historian Josephus wrote, quote, For there was a ridge of mountains that terminated at the sea, which were impassable by reason of their roughness in their flight. The enormous beach at present-day Nueva is certainly large enough to have held several million people in their flocks. And to the south, the mountains extend to the sea, making further travel impossible. When Ron first explored this beach in 1978, he saw the mountains of which Josephus wrote that blocked further travel to the south. To the north he found the very ancient remains of an old Egyptian fortress, most likely built as an outpost for troops assigned to protect the Egyptian mine workers in the region from attacks from the north. The old structure remained in use for many, many years, as it had been repaired many times. Ron believes this was Pi-hahiroth. Many people believe that the parting of the Red Sea could only have occurred at a place where it is relatively shallow. Perhaps that is why most people believe it took place at the Gulf of Suez, which is quite shallow compared to the Gulf of Aqaba, which in some places is 5,000 feet deep. It is also about 8 miles across from the beach at Nuweiba. The few bathymetric maps Ron was able to find showed that the depths from the Nuweiba beach to the opposite shore reached a maximum of about 900 feet, gently sloping, while on each side there were sheer drops to about 5,000 feet. There certainly appeared to be an underwater path which could have been traveled with the water removed. When Ron and the boys first came to Nuweiba, they went to the south end of the beach. There Ron found a Phoenician-style column lying in the sand near the water's edge. Examining it, he saw that there were no inscriptions still legible. Water erosion had damaged it beyond any repair. At that time, the Sinai was being occupied by the Israelis, and they were in the process of using dynamite to level part of the mountains that reached the Gulf in order to drive their tanks along the coast. Ron pointed out the fallen column to an army officer, and the next time he returned, he found they had moved it back from the beach and set it in concrete. He would later learn the significance of that lone column. He and the boys then donned their scuba gear and began to investigate what may lie beneath the waters of the crystal-clear Gulf. The biblical account told of Pharaoh's army being drowned when the parted waters rushed together, and Exodus 14:24 further tells that the Lord, quote, took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily. On the first dive, Ron found chariot wheels preserved by the coral which had attached to it. He found an axle with portions of each wheel still present, one lying flat and the other extending several feet above the ground. These chariot wheels were very difficult to see and recognize because they are covered in coral, and the portions that were not covered have disintegrated. Most wheels he found had 6 spokes. However, he found several 8-spoked wheels. He removed this one and took it to Nassif Hassan, who was then head of antiquities in Cairo. With no hesitation, he told Ron it was from the 18th dynasty. Thinking his answer a bit quick and perhaps too casual, Ron inquired how he could make such an identification upon first sight. Mr. Hassan explained that the ancient Egyptians only used the 8-spoked wheel at one time in all their history, during the 18th dynasty. In February of 1988, he found this gold 4-spoked chariot wheel in the same general area. There is no coral on the main part of the wheel, because coral doesn't attach to gold, only around the hub area where some wood was exposed when it came off the chariot. While the style of this wheel is similar to that found on the walls of ancient Egyptian tombs depicting chariot making, it also bears a resemblance to ancient Assyrian chariot wheels, which also provides a very important evidence. The abundant evidence shows that there was only one period in ancient Egyptian history when 4, 6, and 8-spoked chariot wheels were used. In his article, Observations on the Evolving Chariot Wheel in the 18th Dynasty, James K. Hoffmeyer in 1976 explains that it was only at the beginning of the 18th Dynasty that the chariot comes into use in the Egyptian army. He also relates how it was only during the 18th Dynasty that the 4, 6, and 8-spoked wheels were used, and that monuments can actually be dated by the number of spokes in the wheel. Exodus 14:6. And he made ready his chariot, and took his people with him, and he took 600 chosen chariots, and all the chariots of Egypt, and captains over every one of them. The Pharaoh took with him every chariot in Egypt, his own, his captains who headed the divisions, and a group called his chosen chariots, which seemed to be in addition to his regular army. There is an inscription of Ramses Meriamun that tells that he had an army of 20,000 troops, which was divided into 4 divisions. This implies that each division consisted of 5,000 troops. But many times the pharaoh took more than just soldiers into battle. The priesthood and the military were closely associated. The Egyptian government was a combination church and state, so to speak. There were many, many gods in ancient Egypt, but the ultimate god was the one represented as the sun and known throughout the various times as Amun, Aten, and Ra or Re, among other names. It was this ultimate god that the pharaoh was considered the earthly embodiment of. The divisions of the army were named after the gods. For example, the first army, that of Amun, the army of Ra, the army of Ta, and the army of Sutek. When the army set out to war, elaborate ceremonies were performed at the temples, asking the various gods to give them victory over their foes. Then booty that was gained as a result of victories was dedicated to the priesthood and temples of the deities. All military victories were directly attributed to the favor of the gods. Many times, if an upcoming battle was considered to be particularly important or difficult, the priests of the various gods would accompany the army to the battlefield in hopes that the god or gods would show special favor in their endeavors. When the pharaoh set out after the children of Israel, he had seen the power of the true God, the great I Am, during the terrible plagues. If the Egyptian army ever needed supernatural intervention by the hands of their so-called gods, it was at this time. Since the gold-veneered chariot wheel Ron found was on the Egyptian side of the gulf, this indicates that it was at the rear of the army. A priest who is not trained in battle would most certainly be in this position at the rear.
Okay, we're out here at the beach that the Israelites came out on when they came out of the canyon system that they had been following by the leading of the cloud, and of course following Moses, who was following the cloud. And they came out on this beach and proceeded to the south, which is this direction. There was an old Egyptian fortress up to the left, Pi-Haroth, and so they turned southward, and of course the cloud turned southward, and that was what they were following.
Soon after entering this area, the Israelites set up camp beside the sea, whose waters presented
The Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians 4:25, "For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." The traditional Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula was identified as such by Helena, mother of Constantine. This Roman emperor, who converted to Christianity in 312 AD, claimed to have had supernatural revelations and visions, some of which revealed to him the locations of several biblical events. He sent his mother Helena to the Middle East, where she pointed out the locations her son had seen in his visions. Then in 527 AD, the Emperor Justinian built the monastery of St. Catherine's on the northwest slope of Jebel Musa in the Sinai Peninsula. On the site, he claimed that Helena had erected a small church 2 centuries earlier. The identification of this mountain rests only on a dream of a heathen convert who sent his mother to identify the mountain based only on his description over 1,700 years after the Exodus. When Ron found the chariot remains in 1978, he knew that the real Mount Sinai was in Arabia, just as Paul had written. He applied for a visa to enter Saudi Arabia and go to Jebel el-Lawz, the highest mountain in the rugged region along the eastern shore of the Gulf. But after 4 years of silence at his request, in January of 1984, he and his sons entered the country illegally by walking across the Jordanian border. Hitchhiking and hiring taxis, they made their way to Jebel el-Lawz. There Ron saw enough evidence to know he had the right mountain, but his excitement was soon dampened when a Bedouin in a pickup truck hastily drove up and told their driver they had to leave immediately for the border. When they arrived at the border, they were arrested. The charge: espionage for the State of Israel. Over and over Ron explained why he was there, and late one afternoon they took him in a helicopter and told him to show them where he believed the great multitude crossed the sea. He directed them to the beach directly opposite Nuweiba, where he could clearly see from the air. They landed, and close to the helicopter was a Phoenician-style column, still standing, with inscriptions in archaic Hebrew. The Saudis made numerous photos, chattering excitedly, and Ron explained that he believed it was erected in ancient times to mark the crossing site, and told them that he had found an identical one on the opposite shore, whose inscriptions had been eroded away since it had fallen in the surf. That column probably saved Ron and the boys' lives. It was the shred of evidence that gave his story credence. But it was 78 days before they were cleared of the bogus charges, which Ron later learned were phoned into the Saudi embassy by an acquaintance who had once worked with him on several projects.
3 weary Americans came home Monday night. Ronald Wyatt and his sons Daniel and Ronald Jr. returned to Nashville at the end of an amateur archaeology expedition that landed them in a Saudi Arabian jail. They entered Saudi Arabia illegally, searching for the site of the biblical Mount Sinai. Ronald Wyatt and his sons are with us in the studios of our Nashville affiliate WTVF to tell us all about it. Gentlemen, good morning.
Morning.
Mr. Wyatt, you there in the middle, and
Yes.
your sons on either side. Why did you, I didn't know that Mount Sinai was in Saudi Arabian territory. Why did you think it was?
We found some chariot parts that looked like the chariots found in King Tut's tomb in the Gulf of Aqaba, west of this Jebel el-Lawz. We found these at depths from 60 feet out to 200 feet and over a stretch of about 1.5 miles. And we believe that that was the crossing site. And so in the biblical narrative, they arrived at Mount Sinai after crossing the Red Sea. The language in the Bible indicates that they stayed in a mountain, enclosed in a mountain. So an aerial map showed that this Jebel el-Lawz had a large valley enclosed in the rim of an ancient volcano. There's about 5,000 acres in there. We felt this was the place. And in Exodus 24:4 and in Leviticus 6:28, 11:33, and 15:12, it tells of some artifacts that were to be found. There was to be 12 pillars of stone and an altar and some pottery, and so this is why we looked at that particular mountain.
Now, I know that you applied for a visa for about 4 years. It's very difficult to get into Saudi Arabia, and they turned you down, but then you decided to make a quick, and let's ask Daniel this, we'll give him a chance to talk, a quick jump across the border in Jordan and go in illegally. Did you think you could get in and out without being caught?
I don't know. It seemed kind of risky to me, yeah. I didn't think it sounded too easy.
Ronald Jr., why do you think they let you go, finally?
I'm not real sure. I guess they just found out that we weren't spies as they thought we were.
They thought you were Israeli spies, right?
Yeah, that's what we hear.
Any torture, kind of interrogation?
No, they just separated us and made sure our stories matched.
Yes. During the interrogation period, we were interrogated by 3 separate groups, the Coast Guard and then the local General Investigating Group and then from the ministry. And the Coast Guard interrogation was a very frightening experience for people that were totally inexperienced with spies and intrigue and all of this.
Are you going to go back?
We're not going back without the proper papers.
The Wyatts, thank you very much for joining us from Nashville this morning. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to be back.
The Coast Guard is in charge of customs, and they were the ones that arrested us. They took us down to their Coast Guard headquarters, and we met some people there that were quite friendly at first, but we found that they weren't all this friendly. We went through some 3 different periods of interrogation, and the first was by this Coast Guard group. They had a general there that was commanding this, and he interviewed us or interrogated us through an interpreter. And I've never yet been quite convinced that the interpreter told him
what you're saying.
Right, yes. But anyway, after that, then we were interrogated by the General Investigating Office that was in charge of that area. I think their office is in Tobuk. And then after that, they sent some people out from the ministry. This is the kings from Riyadh, you know, the seat of the government, and had a few questions for us too. And during this time, of course, they kept us separated so we couldn't get our stories together or whatever. They didn't tell us a whole lot. We were held incommunicado. They declined allowing us to talk with a representative of our government, which international law requires that they do. And so we were pretty much in the dark. They would, after the preliminary or the main interrogation, periodically they would take one or the other of us up to this head honcho's office and ask us a few more questions. And I think they were getting these questions from their archaeology department. They were seeing if we really were archaeologists or if we were Israeli spies, which is what they accused us of being. Well, in Numbers 24:4, for the people in the audience that are Bible scholars, it says that Moses rose up early in the morning and set up 12 pillars of stone and erected an altar. All right, we felt that this would still be there because people in that part of the country, the Bedouins and a lot of these people, their agreements, instead of being on paper, they set up these little things of stone, which apparently they have some means of interpreting what these little stacks of stones mean. And so all these things are left alone. They're not necessarily sacred, but they are just things that, you know, people do not bother. We felt that there was a high likelihood that those stones would still be there, and so we found those. And they appeared to be intact. There had been some sand blown in over up partway on the north end of the altar and some of the stones on that end.
Soon after arriving home, Ron received a call from a Saudi Bedouin prince by the name of Samran. He had heard about Ron's claim after his release and had become obsessed with seeing what he called Moses Mountain. Moses is recognized by the Muslim faith as a true prophet. Samran even flew to Nashville, determined to convince Ron to return with him. And finally, 11 months after his release from Saudi prison, Ron relented. In March 1985, Ron journeyed to Turkey to show a new associate, David Fassold, the site of Noah's Ark. Samran joined them, and the three viewed the remains of the Ark in the snow. Ron was then provided a visa to enter Saudi legally, and Mr. Fassold was invited to join them, an offer he did not refuse. With a full work crew and provisions, they went to the mountain where they thoroughly explored the area. An archaeologist from Riyadh University was brought in and verified the archaeological value of the site. Ron was asked to stay and excavate, but he had other meetings in Turkey which couldn't be changed. His refusal angered the Saudis, who are not used to being told no, and all their photos, film, and video were confiscated. Ron was told they would be returned to them when he returned and excavated as they had requested. After he left, the area was fenced off and signs erected stating it was an archaeological site and trespassing forbidden, but once again he left empty-handed. He began to make plans to return as they had requested, and met with former astronaut James Irwin to enlist the participation of his organization. But future requests, both by Ron and Colonel Irwin on his behalf, were met with refusals. With time to reflect upon the situation, the Saudis had decided it was not in their best interest for Mount Sinai to be in their country. 3 years later, a member of Jim Irwin's organization, along with one of their financiers, succeeded in getting into the country and getting some photos, having gotten complete directions and details from Mr. Fassold. They then made the claim that they had discovered Mount Sinai. But it wasn't to be long before Ron would have more documentation than he ever dreamed possible. The story is too long to be told here, but by 1992, the photos and videos he so desperately desired literally fell into his hands. However, for now, we must protect the identity of those who took the photos and videos and gave them freely to Ron with no stipulations. Exodus 14:30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. The waters of the sea had closed in on Pharaoh and his army, and now many of their bodies lay lifeless upon the vast Arabian shore. As charioteers and horsemen, their swords and weapons were bound to their bodies and were gathered up by the unarmed Israelites. The mountain of God lay to their southeast, an easy journey through the large wadi just beyond the marker where Ron found the column in 1984. But had they proceeded directly to the mountain from the sea, they would have entered the large open plain and been an easy prey to the fierce warring Amalek. Instead, the biblical account tells of a different route through the wilderness of Etham, also called the wilderness of Shur, the mountainous region which surrounded the shores of the Gulf. For 3 days they followed the cloud through the barren wilderness. As their water supply grew scarce, they became fearful. Then they came to Marah, where there was a spring, but the water was bitter and undrinkable. The people murmured against Moses, blaming him, even though they were being led by the cloud and the pillar of fire. When Moses prayed for wisdom as to what to do, he was shown a tree by the Lord, which he was told to cast into the waters, and which made them sweet and drinkable. There are several springs in this vast mountainous region, but we cannot identify Marah with certainty. Their next stop was Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. Palm trees are extremely rare on this side of the Gulf, but here, spanning across a wide wadi, is an oasis with hundreds of palm trees and 12 wells of water, still used today. The 70 palm trees have proliferated into hundreds, but the fact that there are 12 wells which are today walled in concrete and still used in this extremely arid region is very strong evidence that this was Elim. The next stage of their journey is given in both Exodus and Numbers, which seem to contradict each other. Exodus says, And they came to Elim, and they encamped there by the waters. And they took their journey from Elim, and came unto the wilderness of Sin. While in Numbers we read that they left Elim and encamped by the Red Sea, and from the Red Sea encamped in the wilderness of Sin. This seeming contradiction is easily explained now that the site has been located. For 3 days they had wandered through the mountainous region south of the crossing site. These mountains extend to the sea, making travel along the coast impossible. Then they came to Elim, located at the south end of these mountains. After drawing their water, the Israelites set up camp. Because of the great number of people and animals, they filled the wadi from Elim westward to the nearby Red Sea shore. The wilderness of Sin between Elim and Sinai is a large barren plain nestled between the mountains along the sea and the mountain range which contains Mount Sinai. Southeast of Elim is Al-Bad, the largest oasis in the region and the home of Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. Down through the ages until this very day, local traditions abound about Jethro and Moses in Al-Bad. It was in this wilderness of Sin that the multitude again murmured against Moses and Aaron for bringing them into this barren desert to die of hunger. And it was here that the Lord first gave them manna, which appeared every day except for the Sabbath. In the south portion of the plain, they retained some protection against the attack of the fierce Amalek, because the mountains along the sea and the longest arm of the Jabal Allah's range extend toward one another, forming a limited barrier to the north. But when they journeyed through the mountain pass, they were fully exposed. And here the cloud turned and led them east into the foothills on the western side of the great mountain range. Here they had limited protection within the hilly region. Exodus 17:1, And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys, according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. And once again the people became greatly upset with Moses. And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river. Take in thy hand, and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Visible for many miles around, this large rock, about 6 stories in height, stands atop this hill over 100 feet above the plain. With the elders looking on, Moses climbed atop the rocky hill to the standing boulder and struck it with his staff. From within the wall of the crack, large streams of water flowed out into the plain. The channels this water cut into the rock is still visible between the large crack, and the direction of the water flow can be seen in the channels cut into the earth. The rock of the hill upon which the boulder still sits displays signs of water erosion. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. Since the multitude was hidden only in the foothills as they traveled to Rephidim, the Amalek may have seen the cloudy pillar by day and fire by night, which may not have been visible while they traveled through the mountainous region. In Deuteronomy 25:18, Moses recounts the attack and how the Amalek, quote, met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary. Though a surprise attack from the rear, their position seemed to have afforded them some strategic advantage, for they were able to organize an army and go to battle the next day, armed with the weapons of the drowned Egyptians. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men, and go out, fight with the Amalek tomorrow. I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. After the battle, Moses built an altar to the Lord just a few 100 yards from the rock which brought forth the streams of water, and he called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. Rephidim means plains, and the flat land amid the foothills of the mountain range consists of thousands of acres, more than enough room for the great multitude to have camped, and for a great battle to have taken place. They had entered this wilderness of sin exactly 1 month after they had left Egypt, and would reach the encampment at Mount Sinai exactly 2 months after leaving Egypt. This indicates that they spent possibly up to 3 weeks here, and the area is abundant with evidences of their stay. These plains are littered with the remnants of ancient structures such as these round hut circles. Though no one knows their exact function, it appears that a large center stone held up a tent, while smaller stones were placed along the edge of the tent to secure it. This would provide protection for a sleeping family from any wild animals as well as from their own flocks. After the Amalek attack, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses in the wilderness, where he encamped at the mountain of God. Rephidim is located on the western side of the great mountain range the Bedouins still call Jebel Musa. The split rock from which the water came forth was called the rock at Horeb. They were at the holy mountain, but they were on the western side. Their next encampment would be on the eastern side. Exodus 19:1. In the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai, for they were departed from Rephidim, and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness. And there Israel camped before the mount. From Rephidim they continued their journey around the mountain range, first going north, then circling around to the east and south. As they entered the foothills on the eastern side, the rocky cliffs rose hundreds of feet on either side. Sandstone mountains were soon replaced by towering granite cliffs which rose to greater heights around them. Finally, they entered a massive plain surrounded by granite walls, which can be seen in this satellite photo. The cloud which was leading them stopped, and they gazed upon the lofty peak of Mount Sinai. Here was to be their home for almost a year. This was not an arbitrary stop along the route to Canaan. The people had nearly lost all true knowledge of God while under the influence of heathen Egypt. Had God not intervened, all knowledge may have been lost. When called by God to lead the people out of Egypt, Moses had asked, "When I shall come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them?" The voice from the midst of the fire replied, "I am that I am." And he said, "Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you." Almost 1,500 years later, Christ would say to the Jews, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am." I am was the voice in the burning bush. The knowledge of a coming Redeemer was known from the time Adam fell and the blood sacrifices were instituted which pointed to his death. Abraham knew and understood what had to occur. As Christ later said to the Jews, John 8:56, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." The events of the Exodus were part of the plan that had been decided in heaven, the plan of salvation for downfallen man, and at the mountain more details of that plan were about to emerge. God was personally intervening to prepare the people who were given the privilege of taking the knowledge of Him to the world. As soon as they arrived, God spoke to Moses. Exodus 19:10. Go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the third day. For the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. Before the Lord came down upon the mountain in the sight of the people, He instructed Moses. Exodus 19:12. Thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourselves that ye go not up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall be surely put to death. In 1985, Ron and the others had found a number of large, circular pillars buried in the earth along these lines in front of the holy area or holy precinct. They are an average of 18 feet in diameter, spaced approximately 5 feet apart, and constructed with 2 walls built of stone. Loose rock was used to fill in between the inner and outer wall. Since they progressed from one side of the mountain to the other, Ron had theorized that perhaps they were the bounds erected by Moses. But at the same time he questioned why these pillars would contain double walls if they were only boundary markers. Another problem was the fact that only a few inches to a few feet was extending above the ground, while approximately 20 feet was buried. These facts and other evidences led Ron to conclude that these were not the boundaries. He now believes that the bounds were stone walls constructed of black basaltic rock without mortar. In this region of millions of rocks, it is difficult to distinguish these remains when viewed close up. But from a distance their pattern becomes visible because of their dark color against the neutral tones of the earth. Once located from a distance, they could be recognized at close range. Though mostly crumbled today, they can be seen to follow along these lines. Once the bounds were erected, the people gathered at the foot of the mountain. While in Egypt they had been exposed to the heathen worship of the sun god known as Ra. Here the people would worship God while facing west, with their backs to the rising sun. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning, that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly.
I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth.
The great I Am spoke the 10 precepts of his law with his own mouth, and it was to be the last time he personally spoke to the multitude. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. No man could see God and live. Therefore he veiled his presence in the cloud and smoke, and he descended to the earth upon the mountain of Sinai. For the Lord thy God is a consuming fire. Not only was the top of the mountain blackened by the fire of his presence, it literally melted. The mountains melted from before the Lord, even that Sinai from before the Lord God of Israel. God then called Moses up into the mountain and gave him judgments and statutes, which Moses carefully wrote down. His great law, the 10 Commandments, were the constitution of God's government, unchangeable and universal. The judgments and statutes given to Moses were specific policies to uphold equal justice in the community. Today, statutes are framed to deal with individual situations where it may not be clear as to how to deal with it. But these laws always fall within the confines of the Constitution. This is an example of the statutes God gave to Moses. And if a man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or an ass fall therein, the owner of the pit shall make it good, and give money to the owner of them, and the dead beast shall be his. Moses wrote down all the Lord told him. God ended his conversation with Moses with his promise to deliver the people into Canaan and all the blessings of prosperity if they obeyed his commands. He had proposed a contract or covenant with the children of Israel. Moses, as the liaison between God and the people, would present the terms of the contract to the people. Then they would decide if they accepted or declined. But first Moses was instructed to make certain preparations. An altar of earth thou shalt make unto me, and shalt sacrifice thereon thy burnt offerings, and thy peace offerings, thy sheep, and thine oxen. In all places where I record my name I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee. And if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone. For if thou lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. Neither shalt thou go up by steps unto mine altar, that thy nakedness be not discovered thereon. At the foot of the mountain, in the holy precinct, just below the blackened peak that had trembled at the presence of God, Moses built an altar of unhewn stone, approximately 50 to 60 feet long and about 25 feet deep. It's about 4 feet high. Directly adjacent to this altar is a fenced area of the same approximate size which joins the altar. Though the structures are crumbled, it can still be seen that there are 2 entrances into the walled-in area, which is divided into 2 equal sections by a freestanding wall which extends lengthwise down the center. And he sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Based on the layout of the altar and adjacent structure, it appears that an orderly system was devised for making the vast number of offerings that would have resulted from a population close to the size of the 5th largest city in the United States. The young men led the live animals near the altar. Each animal was then slain, its blood carefully gathered into vessels which were given to Moses or the priests. The young man then picked up the dead animal and entered the corridor, waiting in turn to give the animal to the priest administering the offerings at the altar. This done, he then turned and left by the other corridor, exiting at the doorway. Beside the altar, Moses erected 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. From Abraham, then Jacob, down through the ages, this practice of setting up pillars to commemorate agreements continued. As late as 1886, the Apache warrior Geronimo surrendered himself and his band of warriors to the United States Army after reaching an agreement that they would be allowed to live with their families. When the agreement was concluded with General Miles, Geronimo set up a large stone on a blanket as a witness to their treaty. When the treaty was broken by General Miles, Geronimo stated that their treaty was to have been in effect until the stone crumbled. Of the 12 pillars, only a few are still standing. The others lay scattered throughout the holy precinct, probably the result of earthquake activity in the region. When the sacrifices were made, the terms of the contract or covenant were presented to the people. Moses took the book of the covenant and read it in the audience of the people, and they said, All that the Lord hath said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, and sprinkled it on the people, and said, Behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. The contract between God and the children of Israel was now ratified. God had presented his absolute demands and what he offered in return. The people signified their acceptance and agreement to the terms. The 12 pillars, one for each of the 12 tribes, commemorated the agreement. Moses was summoned again up into the mountain, this time bringing Aaron, his sons, and the 70 elders of Israel. Directly above the altar is a plateau in the mountain just below the scorched black of the high peak. We believe this is where the group of men did eat and drink, and saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heaven in its clearness. They were given the same glimpse of the heavenly throne that Ezekiel saw in vision. Then I looked, and behold, in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubim, there appeared over them, as it were, a sapphire stone, as the appearance of the likeness of a throne. Moses was again called up into the mountain, this time with Joshua. For 6 days the men waited, and then, on the 7th day, God called Moses up into the cloud that covered the very top of the mount, into the presence of the Lord. For 40 days he remained there while Joshua waited for him in the lower plateau. In the midst of the blackened peak is a hollow area within the burned top which appears unscorched. From this hollow there is a visible pathway leading down to the plateau. We believe this was where Moses met with God and received the ceremonial law, the statutes and judgments, and the 10 commandments. Moses carefully recorded all he was told. Then something terrible occurred. The Lord said unto Moses, Go, get thee down, for thy people which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed unto it, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. Moses pleaded with God for his people, that he not destroy them, and finally God accepted his plea on their behalf. But Moses' anger with the people was also great. With the 2 tables of stone cradled in his arms, Moses began down the mountain and approached Joshua, waiting in the plateau. As he came near, Joshua said, There is a noise of war in the camp. But Moses replied, It is not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is it the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but the noise of them that sing do I hear. Unto the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hand, and brake them beneath the mount. While Moses had been in the mountain, judicial authority had been given to Aaron. Since Moses was gone so long, the people returned to their old superstitions and demanded an image to represent God. The Egyptian cow gods of Hathor and Apis were selected, and a golden calf was made, in direct contradiction to the commandment of God that they were not to make any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. The altar to the golden calf was visible to Moses and Joshua as they descended the mount. Located about 2 kilometers from the altar at the foot of Mount Sinai, it still contains the images carved into the rock depicting the Egyptian Apis bull and Hathor the cow goddess. These images made the greatest of impressions upon the Saudi archaeologist in 1985, who told Ron that nowhere else in Saudi Arabia are these found. They are distinctly ancient Egyptian. When Ron climbed upon these boulders, still wet with the morning dew, the top of the large boulder sitting horizontally across the top caught his eye. When he wiped away the dew, he saw tiny flecks of gold dust embedded in the top of the rock, which had a smooth indentation along the surface, like something had been ground on it, causing it to wear down the surface. Moses had taken the calf which ye made, and burned it with fire, and stamped it, and ground it very small, even until it was as small as dust. And I cast the dust thereof into the brook that descended out of the mount. The evidence suggests that Moses ground the golden calf to dust on the altar itself. Then, gathering the powdery dust, he put it in the brook that descended out of the mount. Looking down from the plateau, the path of the stream can be clearly seen, although no water flows there today. The evidence indicates that the water from the mountain stream flowed into the lake, and around the lake they built a large system of wells. The wells extended to the bedrock along the stream and around the edge of the lake, with only a few feet extending above the ground. As the water flowed towards the lake, it soaked into the dry, rocky earth down to the bedrock. Then it seeped through the rock walls of the wells and continually filled them to the level of the lake. The double walls of the well, filled with smaller rock in between, acted as a filter and purified the water. Stone walls built of black stone not only lined the bounds around the mountain edges, they also followed along the banks of the stream extending into the holy precinct. Each day as the people came to draw water, they were constantly in view of the magnificent Mount Sinai, which surely impressed them with the knowledge that they were totally dependent upon the Lord for their precious water. There was only one way to enter the holy area. That was through the narrow strip of land between the border of the mountain and the lake on the north end. Even today, this is the only means by which the area can be entered without one having to scale the steep rocky walls of the dry lake bed. The white columns glistening in the sun that had caught Ron's eye just before he was arrested in January of 1984 still lie scattered near the altar. While there in 1985, Ron was told that the white marble shrine that had once been there had been disassembled and taken to Hegel years earlier and used in the construction of a mosque. Only the broken and small pieces had been left behind. But Ron found one piece that contained an inscription in archaic Hebrew. Knowing that he wouldn't be allowed to remove it, he quietly buried it, but he made note of the inscription, which he later had translated. The inscription, though incomplete, was very similar to that one on the column on the beach, and contained Solomon's name, Mizraim, or Egypt, and Moses, which indicated to Ron that Solomon had also erected these items to commemorate the great event of the Exodus. And the Lord said unto Moses, Hew thee 2 tables of stone like unto the first, and I will write upon these tables the words that were in the first tablets, which thou breakest. For 40 days and nights Moses again stayed atop the mountain, and the Lord wrote the 10 Commandments, this time on the stones Moses had prepared. When he returned to the camp with the tables of stone, his face glowed with supernatural light, and the people were afraid to come near him. So he veiled his face and gathered the congregation to tell them all that God had told them. Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle, and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall ye make it. The ordinance of the sacrificial system, or ceremonial law, was made up of symbols pointing to the future Messiah, to his sacrifice and his priesthood. The solemn service of the sanctuary typified the grand truths that were to be revealed through successive generations. The cloud of incense ascending with prayers of Israel represented his righteousness that alone can make the sinner's prayer acceptable to God. The bleeding victim on the altar of sacrifice testified of a Redeemer to come, and from the Holy of Holies the visible token of the divine presence shone forth. The sanctuary was patterned after things in the heavens, holy places which were figures of the true, as Paul explained. The room that contained his earthly throne, the mercy seat, was called the most holy place and represented the throne of God in heaven. There I will meet with thee, and I will commune with thee from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim which are upon the ark of the testimony. Beneath the mercy seat, within the ark of the testimony, were the tables of stone written by God's own finger and spoken by his own lips in the hearing of all of Israel. Thus was signified that God's government rested upon these laws, the complete standard of righteousness, and that they would be in force throughout eternity. When the tabernacle and its furnishings were completed, instructions were given on the manner of the encampment. In the center of the camp the tabernacle was set up. Around it on the north, south, and east were the tents of the Levites who had the care of the tabernacle and the services therein. On the west side were the tents of Moses, Aaron, and his sons. Afar off from these, the other tribes were assigned to the north, south, east, and west. Beyond can be seen the vastness of the camp of the Israelites. About 10 miles in length from north to south, it's approximately 6 miles wide. To the west and north it is shielded by the sheer cliffs of the mountain range. To the east and south it is surrounded by the smaller dark hills, giving it the appearance of a massive ancient volcanic rim. The mixed multitude which had left Egypt with them was not allowed in the camp itself, and we believe they made their camps in the smaller plain to the east, which was separated from the main camp by the lower dark-colored mountains, which also resemble the rim of an ancient volcano. And here was home to the great multitude for almost a year. Here in this desolate region was an entire nation unto itself, sustained completely by God. The manna which fell here long ago ceased, but one very precious evidence remained. The Bible tells us about the manna. The people went about and gathered it, and ground it in mills, or beat it in a mortar, and baked it in pans, and made cakes of it. The broken millstone that was found in the camp did not belong to any of the handful of Bedouin who still roam through the area today. Their diet consists largely of dates, figs, camel's milk, and camel's meat. There is no grain here, no wheat, no corn. There is nothing to grind. But over 3,000 years ago, a whole nation of people daily ground manna in mills, and one of those broken millstones was left behind. After all the wonderful miracles God wrought in the deliverance of his people, when they left Mount Sinai and came to the border of the Promised Land, because of their lack of faith, God did not lead them in. Instead, they were doomed to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. Only 2 men who had left Egypt entered the land of Canaan, Joshua and Caleb. Why has God revealed these evidences today, after almost 3,500 years? Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10:11, "These things happened to them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come." Today we are at the border of the Promised Land, not the Canaan of old, but the city which hath foundation, whose builder and maker is God. Will we enter? Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life, and may enter in through the gates into the city.
Herodotus writes of a contrivance the Egyptians used to construct them. Quote, "The method employed was to build it in steps, or, as some call them, tiers or terraces. When the base was complete, the blocks for the first tier above it were lifted from ground level by contrivances made of short timbers. On the first tier there was another, which raised the blocks a stage higher, then yet another which raised them higher still. Each tier or story had its own set of levers, or it may be that they used the same one, which, being easy to carry, they shifted up from the stage to stage as soon as its load was dropped into place. This passage, combined with the study of hieroglyphics, led Ron to his conclusion." Allowed to construct one of these machines on a pyramid, he demonstrated to the head of the Department of Antiquities in Cairo, Nasif Mohammed Hassan, its operation. Mr. Hassan then showed Ron some pieces of wood they had stored, which they had believed were parts of a boat. But when they tried to assemble them, they couldn't. So they simply placed them in storage. As they examined these pieces, they now knew what they were.
I'm here with us this evening to say a few words about the pyramid building machines is Nasif Hassan. He's the Director of Antiquities in Egypt, and he will give you an idea of what he believes about these, how the pyramids were built.
I'm very glad to see that this machine, which Mr. White showed me, and I think they used something like that.
Exodus 15:8. And with the blast of thy nostrils the waters were gathered together. The floods stood upright as an heap, and the depths were congealed in the heart of the sea. Now, while we aren't saying that God is limited in the way he can accomplish his purpose, we're suggesting that should he have directed a jet stream down into the sea at the crossing site, blowing from east to west, that this would have driven back the sea and frozen it in place. And the word congealed in Exodus 15:8 agrees with the thought of the water freezing. And then as the pillar of fire passed through between the Israelites and the Egyptians, it could have melted the ice to the point that it gave way when the Egyptian army was in the sea and the Israelites out on the other side.